Ah, China, how your games never cease to amuse me. If you've been watching the show for a while, you'll note there seems to be three types of MMOs that come out of China. First, you've got the straight-up knockoffs. Perhaps a game like Monster Hunter Online never got ported to the US, so a company takes it upon themselves to make a near-exact copy of the game, give it a different title, and try to pass it off as an original creation. Then there's the overly complex games. Odd interfaces, tons of convoluted mechanics that people who've been playing the game for years still haven't entirely figured out, like Age of Wushu. And then you've got kind of polished and simple fun MMOs like those usually offered by X-Legend, see Eden Eternal or Aura Kingdom, where elements of the former exist, but the presentation is so fantastic that you just don't seem to notice or mind. So, where does this game sit? Somewhere in the middle. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at Black Gold. Black Gold is a semi-typical steampunk-ish fantasy MMO featuring plenty of the fantasy MMO staples: two-faction war, class-based combat systems, explorable worlds with simple go-here-kill-that quests. What makes Black Gold different is not only that charm you can only get from Suzo Snail Electronic Co. Limited, it's that the game itself is a pretty interesting and fun concept, as long as you ignore the very obvious fact it was pretty much copied from James Cameron's Avatar, right down to the animal-riding blue cat people being at war with a militaristic human nation equipped with mech suits. Also, they had Avril Lavigne do an ad for the game with a broken English script.
I'm Hasty. Besides music, games can be punk rock too. Mixture of vintage and science fiction. Enjoy the freedom challenge, the extraordinary. Desired Black Gold. The double temptation. That's a new world we are waiting for.
Oh, Snail, you're like the Birdemic of MMOs. In typical Snail fashion, I was actually contacted to do a guided preview of Black Gold when it went in alpha, but the day never came and I was never contacted when I said I was going to be, hence the late side quest. While the game is technically an open beta, they already announced a new expansion for the game. An expansion? For a game still in open beta. I love you, Snail, never change. The graphics here are what you'd come to expect from Snail games. They won't blow you away and can be rather generic at times, but they do have a pleasantly realistic style with a few striking moments, similar to their more well-known title Age of Wushu. For the most part, the characters are all decently modeled and textured, and while many can be considered generic steampunk NPCs, there aren't many that come to mind being absurd or just downright hideous to look at. This extends to the character creator, though you can make a hideously deformed mutant with a myriad of slider bars that you're allowed for each character. In general, you'll find that this is a rather robust creator system, even if it takes a bit to wrap your head around the odd way they'll allow for color changing. There should be a note of certain caution here that hair color seems to be slightly off from what the creator says it will be, and in typical Snail Games fashion of messing up the simpler things, all helmets in the game have hard-coded hair colors and styles loaded with them instead of using your creator's choices. So don't panic if your short-haired graying warrior suddenly has long shoulder-touching pink hair because you put a hat on. Just hide the helmet in the function section of the settings menu. The mechs and beasts, or as the game calls them, battle carriers, of either faction do have a lot of surprising detail work put into them, but it's hard not to feel that the Erlander, the more in touch with nature faction to Eisenhorst's steampunk industrial revolution, got the short end of the stick here. While Erlander beasts can look intimidating and cool, they also have some beasts that look incredibly silly, if not downright laughable to look at. You might notice a rather major issue popping up almost immediately. The animation quality is absolutely terrible. Every NPC, every battle carrier, every mount, and literally everything that has an animation is very sloppy and stiff, which is a real shame coming from Snail Games, as Age of Wushu had some generally very impressive, fast, energetic-looking animations to go with that kung fu style. For example, you will notice that mounts don't even bother to try to turn, but instead shoot off at 90-degree angles whenever your strafe key is pushed. You might also notice that characters and background models, like giant robots who are extremely far away from the player, will have their animations slowed to a stop-motion style crawl. This isn't a bug, but rather a slapdash feature to keep rendering times and engine strain to a minimum. With the animations being rather rough, the models themselves have a bad habit of clipping through cloaks, weapons, and even the armor you're wearing. It's perhaps most notable on the female not Navi characters, whose ass will literally push out the back of their pants whenever they walk. The game also has a very bad habit of keeping the same generic fauna and biome over massive expanses. And while this can be used to give a better sense of scale, with proper pacing allowing players to quest through them in a reasonable time, here these quests seem to drag out so long that as an Eisenhorse player you'll get very sick of deserts sprinkled with dead plants and tall dry grass very quickly. This gets exacerbated by the sporadic in-game cutscenes that highlight just how desolate the world feels and how terrible the animations are. Everything feels just very low quality, all being topped with an in-game loading screen before it plays. God forbid you actually try to watch the pre-rendered cutscenes, which hilariously look far worse than the in-game ones, and have a muddy overlay texture rendered at about 480p, and run at a rather oddly specific 51 FPS. All in all, it's what I'd expect from Snail. Flashes of brilliance and imagination steeped in incompetence. It's gonna be a running theme through a lot of these categories. The first thing to note about sound is that, oh my god, it is so freaking loud! After that, you may notice that the sound design is rather generic. I sense a pattern here. Nothing really seems to fit perfectly for what it's used for. As an example, take the music, which occasionally sounds so out of place and so dull that it might just take you several minutes before you realize that the music even stopped playing to begin with. Tones repeat, and the loops seem both short and just annoying enough to notice, but not so annoying that you'll be bothered to adjust the music at all. In fact, sound adjustment is all over the place. Have a slider placed at around a quarter volume level? It's barely audible. Inch it over just slightly to the near halfway point? Blow out your speakers. It's baffling. Weapons fire and swords do sound far better, but also rather weak comparative to your attacks, such as heavy cannons sounding rather dull, and massive swords not giving off enough of an impactful strike. Another annoyance is that your character will audibly grunt with every single attack, which can be alright if using slower attacking heavy weaponry. But for light, rapid attack classes, the sound of constant grunting gets grating, and it's rather unnecessary when you already have loud effects going for every attack. In fact, unremarkability is the name of the game here when it comes to both music and sound design. It's just forgettable all around. At the start of the game, you'll need to decide between either major faction, which can be best summed up as the classic struggle of nature versus technology. The Eisenhorse represent a human and dwarf empire that focuses on advanced tech, including airships, tanks, mechs, and seem to exemplify a more romanticized version of the Industrial Revolution. The Airlander, on the other hand, are humans and Kosh who hold steadfast to the beauty and might of nature, focusing almost completely on their reliance with the environment and animals to form a symbiotic relationship, while still having a very basic level of tech to forge weapons and armor for battle. Do note that you can make a character of the opposing faction at any time, provided you have a free character slot left over. Once you've chosen your faction, or as the game confusingly calls it, your alignment, you'll need to select one or two of the starter races. The Eisenhorse will contain the Buvantian humans and the Lochemian dwarves, while the Airlander have the totally not Navi in any way, shape, or form Kosh and the Utonian humans. There's a third race for either faction, but these can only be unlocked once you get a character to level 40. The new race does automatically start at 40 as well, so you won't have to worry about leveling twice just to play the third race. You should keep in mind that while there are not a lot of overlap between the classes, not all classes can be played by all races, and this will affect your choice. If you want to play as a Dwarven Pyromancer or a Kosh Occultist, sorry, you're out of luck. You may notice that the Dwarven females take the Lineage 2 route of being dangerously close to being considered lowly, though despite their generally cherubic faces, they can be made to be extremely busty. A word of warning here as well, there is a well-known bug that has been constantly reported and commented on by the devs, and it's still yet to be fixed. Should you ever make a character and then delete them for whatever reason, the name that you'll use will be permanently reserved on the servers and can never again be used in any circumstance. Snail Games has repeatedly stated that they know exactly what's causing this bug and that they will be fixing it very soon every time it gets reported. The first instance of this was almost a year ago. Once you've finished creating your character, you'll immediately receive one of the many cutscenes mentioned before, and then be dumped directly into a very linear tutorial section. In an odd sense, this tutorial doesn't really help teach you anything, as everything is just far too rushed. It's so basic that it should all come without saying, and it doesn't actually tell you what all these massive amounts of windows, screens, flashing icons, and buttons are for. Once you get to the end of the tutorial, you'll have a boss fight that you cannot physically win, as regardless of never being hit or how much health you take from that boss, you'll see your respective battle carrier get nuked and kicked out of the game to start it proper. Once you get into the main section of the game, you will quickly notice that the UI for NPCs is absolutely terrible, with text that leaves out most of the given text box unused, buttons being in odd places to accept the quest, and generally feeling that the entire thing is in dire need of polish and adjustment. I can't recall this being as much of an issue in the early beta stages, which makes me wonder what changes Snail made to create such an awful mess. Combat itself is a bit of a mixed bag. It tries to be both an action combat system and a tab target system at the same time, with many classes requiring you to have an enemy target selected in order to attack, but it won't automatically change your facing and can allow you to fire off in the distance randomly. Melee seems to have an advantage in this aspect since most melee attacks have large attack cones and don't require you to be actively targeting an enemy for your basic attack. You can use the dodge mechanic, similar to Guild Wars 2, Terra and the Secret World, in order to avoid the large telegraphed attacks, but here we fall into yet another issue. These attacks are so fast that you'll need to react almost instinctively before the warning even appears to hope to avoid them. In general, combat does feel really weighty, but while there's the unfortunate issue that the sound design is lacking, the visual impact of powerful hits that sends the enemies flying, and combat effects can be immensely satisfying, even if it is rather stiff and tough. Another bit of annoyance crops up with just how absurdly fast enemies and items will respawn in this game. At first that sounds like a good thing, allowing you to quickly scoop up your quest items and obliterate through kill quests, but the things can get extremely frustrating when aggressive enemies will spawn almost instantly back into position, making it very easy to attract massive groups of enemies onto yourself by accident. This current rate was clearly designed for a much more active community, but we'll get into that later. Here, you might notice that the quest design is very generic and oftentimes has hilarious bits of oversight. You'll find the usual kill X to gather Y, gather X, talk to X, use item on X, with little variety to differentiate them other than a newly named enemy. There's a more memorable example that makes you think you're about to go on this epic adventure of sabotage and pave the way for the Eisenhorst Empire to assault the rebel stronghold, but ultimately it just sees you walking directly up to enemy pillboxes, planting explosives as they look on while being flagged as neutral, and getting a generic cutscened explosion before going back to turn in the quest. Your inventory is rather limited, but easily upgraded, albeit in a convoluted manner. A common reward given to you in the game are Stones of Emptiness, which state they can expand your inventory. The problem is you can't use them. Well, not in the manner you would think. Instead, you need to click on one of the locked inventory slots, then check off Stones of Emptiness in order to use it to unlock that slot. Later slots cost higher amount of stones, and you can alternatively use black gold, one of the cash shop currencies, to unlock these as well. Keep in mind the game does let you earn black gold through playing the game. What's nice about the equipment system is that you don't usually have to play the "is this piece better" game when finding a new piece. The game will do that for you if the piece that dropped can be worn by you and has a better gear score, referred to in this game as might score. It doesn't check for stats though, so be wary that although a piece might be considered better, you might lose out some of your more important stats if you just blindly accept yes. If you don't want the piece that dropped, a better use of it would be to disassemble it from the inventory screen for some always valuable color crystals. Something you might want to keep an eye on is the ability to upgrade your gear as you level. Doing so requires very specific pieces of gear, usually rewarded from quests, a few of the randomly dropping color crystals, and some cash. The process can be done from anywhere, but oddly it can't be reached with a hotkey, or at least no hotkey any of us were able to find. We had to choose Upgrade Equipment from the menu on the upper right side. The piece needs to be unequipped before you upgrade it, and those crystals may serve better to upgrade the energy crystal or soul equipment piece that gives you a decent all-around stat boost, providing you keep feeding it the correct items. You might notice that when you upgrade your gear, some blue sockets appear. This is where gems come into play. If you've ever played a game like Diablo, Path of Exile, or their ilk, then this system will be very familiar to you. Simply shift and right-click on the item to wish to slot a gem to, assuming it has open slots, and a new window will pop up that is used for gem sockets. Then, drag the gem you wish to use into the slot, and it'll be set in place. These gems come in a variety of sizes and colors. The larger the gem means the more potent the buff, while the gem's color corresponds to the buff it'll grant you. Red for defense, green for magic, blue for physical, purple for critical, and yellow for elemental. It's confusing at first, but once you get the gist of it, it's relatively straightforward. Once you get to level 10, which is a rather simple feat with how fast the early levels fly by, you'll be allowed to create your first battle carrier and to go back to get your revenge on the tutorial boss, who will now be a complete pushover. A major change from the initial beta stages is that Snail Games has opted to remove the fuel system for battle carriers, which would limit your usage of these powerful mechs or creatures to dire situations only, and thus, now being lifted, has allowed their rather insane levels of firepower to be used for regular questing. While at first the removal of fuel might seem like a minor thing, you'll quickly realize that abusing the firepower to destroy enemies, including elite enemies in 1 to 3 seconds, renders fighting them for what would normally take 20 to 30 seconds completely worthless. The game does try to mix things up by adding in dynamic events, but these aren't as dynamic as you might expect from more modern MMOs, and generally boil down to just killing things. This was a real shame, as one dynamic quest for the Eisenhorst was set up and presented as a siegebreaker defense against an overwhelming Erlander invasion force. We expected to see legions of troops rushing out from Dominion City to set up turrets and form battle lines, while dragons flew overhead and bombed the defenses. We got another kill X number of randomly spawning cannon fodder ground infantry, while the Erlander dragon riders looked on, picking their noses or something. The upside to completing these dynamic events is in the treasure points and time vial system, which rewards you for playing the game in an active manner by giving you a time vial every hour, going up in rarity based on the number of treasure points that you've accumulated. These time vials can then be traded in, with a limit of about 30 free time vials a day, to get gems for your gear by refining them or crystals to use in upgrades by gaining them. The issue remains that not too much beyond the mech combat is done with any sense of uniqueness. There's crafting, but you've seen it before. You choose a profession, you spend too much time and materials making gear that's either marginally better or woefully underpowered for your level. So is there any merit to be had in playing this game? Well, certainly, and we'll go over that in the community section, but that's all provided you're lucky enough to find someone who's actually playing the game. This can seem a bit odd to say, but there almost isn't a community here. No, really, battles in the PvP that used to include hundreds of people slugging it out in epic brawls near the beginning of the beta have all but vanished in favor of matches that rarely near 20 people on both sides combined. What's even more of a shame is that the people who do tend to queue for PvP often sit in the spawn area and just go AFK, as there's so little action the majority of the matches ended up with Grindstone members dancing in our mechs in the central capture point for nearly the entire half-hour match. Sadly, you're not likely to run into many new players in the starter zones either, with Grindstone's time in the game managing to only see 2 people that weren't part of our group. This gets back to that issue we mentioned before of respawn timers being tweaked to handle a much larger crowd that just isn't there. I suppose it's comforting for someone who's worried about faction PvP that people actually aren't playing this. During the start of the beta, with hundreds of people flooding the starting zones, you were likely to see large groups of people wandering around into the free-for-all dungeons. These dungeons, often hidden, out-of-the-way areas, could offer good loot and rewards for adventurous players, and now with the non-existent community in lower zones, these dungeons can feel exceptionally cheap. On the other hand, you could always try out the instance dungeons, which function more like you would expect in a traditional MMO, almost to a fault. The first 2 dungeons are short romps through a couple bosses before being dumped back into the overworld, and there really isn't much interesting to talk about. They're the standard run-of-the-mill generic dungeons that you've seen time and time again, and they're so easy for their intended level that no one really needs to worry about the mechanics other than just not standing in the bad. Then you get to the 3rd dungeon, which was widely agreed to be what gave us renewed hope for Black Gold. Rather than a standard dungeon, you instead had to take command of a forward base, prep its defenses, and hold back waves of assaults, as you leveled up its turrets and infantry, set up defenses, and chose when to grant other players buffs. Basically, hold out long enough for each of the 3 bosses to attempt to take the base themselves. It was fast-paced, exciting, and introduced mechanics rarely, if ever, seen before in an MMO, and it made the entire party feel rejuvenated and interested to press on. Sadly, this was quickly dashed by the 4th dungeon, which returned to the same old formula of before, and was so draining that we didn't even bother finishing it. One thing that Black Gold does get right is the guild system, which has a lot of surprising benefits for regular play. You of course get to see when the guild members come online and can form your parties easily, but doing so will actually grant you faster experience gains with the more guild members that join into the party, making it extremely beneficial to remain in a guild party even though you aren't in the same zone. The guild also grants you access to a guild unity buff, which is a flat buff of 250 health, 30 physical power, and 30 spell power, with the buff scaling higher and higher as the guild increases in rank, up to a staggering 3,000 health and 250 physical and spell power. Another feature of guilds and the guild missions, which are quests that the guild members can go on together in order to earn some black gold, the titular item of the game that helps keep the guild running and expanding. As each day passes, the guild will consume 100 black gold, something that even a single member can donate from completing just one mission, but can also be used to increase the level of the guild to open up access to and upgrades to the guild shop, as well as a larger available roster, a bigger unity buff, and more specialty missions to go on. The aforementioned mass PvP mode, Bloodfang Citadel, showed what have likely been promised with the scale of having battle carriers fight for dominance. We actually looked forward to seeing more than one lone Airlander attempt to vie for supremacy. Of course, having a PvP point capture mode where winning means you only need to control one specific capture point makes the whole thing rather odd. You can't even queue for a dungeon unless you find physical people, not to mention that queuing for dungeons is oddly specific and counterintuitive to locate the queue option. The one time I tried, I was in queue for over 2 hours, and I was queued as a tank. Whatever great presence of player Snail assumed would be playing this game isn't here, and the game suffers all the more greatly for it. The first challenge to this cash shop is finding it. It's most easily found by pressing the treasure chest icon in that ever-useful but easily forgotten about right side menu labeled Hidden Treasure Chamber. The cash shop in Black Gold uses 4 currencies. 4! On the bottom of the screen you'll see gold dust, black gold, points, which are only referred to as points on this bottom bar, as they're called vouchers everywhere else, and coupons. I think the real cash shop currency, as in the one you'll be trading for actual cash, are the vouchers, although I can't verify this, as choosing to add points opens up a 404 window in your browser, and choosing top up from Snail's own site asks you to use a separate account login different from the one you play their games and log into their site with. I'm starting to think they don't want our money. A common theme about this cash shop, or hidden treasure chamber, is that it's made up almost entirely of boosters and random items that, while useful for things like crafting and upgrading, are all something that can be found and earned in-game. In fact, the pay-to-win argument can come into play here, but when the quest can be curb-stomped by jumping into a mech, and the PvP consists of you versus the armies of no one else, there's not much to win here. At least personal betterment isn't behind a paywall. Hell, clicking where you'd expect Snail to be looking to gain most of their money, the Fashion tab, only shows you 3 mounts for some reason. Can't help but feel someone screwed that one up, especially when there's a specific male and female tab in the fashion section that does nothing. If you actually want the cosmetic outfits, Snail instead opted for placing them all in random chance boxes. No! Bad Snail! If you do want a mount, there's several in addition to what's inexplicably featured in the Fashion tab by clicking on the Mount tab. You can preview what each of these mounts look like by clicking on the Preview button, unless you wanted to see the Bicephalous Vulture, as I originally thought it wasn't working until I noticed the tip of its wing occasionally popping into view from the top of the preview window. Who the hell coded this, James Nguyen? Long story short, you likely won't even bother looking into this. The game is surprisingly generous with these items, granting them as time rewards, achievement rewards, login rewards, level rewards, PvP rewards, daily lottery rewards, what have you, and not even mounts are something that's hard to come by. Of course, Snail is always happy with the concept of the sub-hybrid, and if you really want to, I suppose the base XP and reward boost of the Knight of Montel status might be the best use of your cash, if you can figure this whole thing out. Granted, they give that to you for free on occasion as well. Black Gold is, well, a bit of an up and down for me. It's too theme-park to have that open-world exploration feel that Age of Wushu had. The combat feels too samey, the questing feels uninteresting. But what I see, like I saw in Wushu, are flashes of brilliance that Snail is known for, and it keeps this game just slightly away from being nothing more than a steampunk version of James Cameron's Avatar. The free use of summonable mechs of various types bring about a new level of combat that could change up the dynamics of battle at any moment. Having class skills be swappable and have their own synergy with other skills allows chances for some theory crafting of class builds. But then you notice you suddenly can't open the map anymore, and you're unable to queue for things because the game still thinks you're in the last dungeon you completed hours ago, and Snail's other signature shines right through. Here's my final rating. The most appealing portion of this game to most players is the promise of mounted combat, be it a rocket-launching walking robot or a flame-breathing dragon. It's fun to collect and upgrade your mechs, as well as have them overpower your enemies or face down the other faction with heavy artillery. As with many of Snail's properties, there's flashes of brilliance. I love the game's ease of use and letting you know what equipment is better. The auto-pathing system is a lot smarter and more direct than it is in most games. The tower defense-styled third dungeon was legitimately entertaining. There's ideas here that I'd love to see in other games. The world itself is also at least interesting in concept. The idea of tech versus nature isn't exactly new, but having it be the sole faction focus of an MMO, and not marking any one faction as evil, isn't seen too often, and sticking with a more steampunk look for the technology side allows it to better blend into a fantasy world. Your best bet for anything spent would be toss in some time on the Knights of Montel status, even if that makes me think you're a cavalry of armored warriors looking to spread the word of a talk show host and his money-lending service. Basic boosts are always nice, but even if you won't feel like you need it, it's still the best use of any cash points. Considering the game dumps so many cash shop items on you already, you'll be hard-pressed to feel like you need to stop in here anytime soon, provided you can find the place. This game lives in this odd space between having way too many things and yet doing nothing with them. There's complex different systems for everything, and many of them just boil down to barely a stat-pointed difference. The carriers are insanely numerous and balances all over the place, and while there's supposedly some sort of rock-paper-scissors mechanic to it, it's not uncommon to feel more like you're playing a game of Dynamite versus waterlogged Kleenex. It just feels like all this effort is being placed on ideas, but not the execution. Consider this game's biggest draw is highly dependent on players, and remember that there are no players. Some people claim that MMOs are dead if they see less than 10 people walking around a questing area. If that's the case, this game is a crumbled tombstone with an unreadable inscription. Main towns and starting areas are ghost towns now. Chat rarely contains more than 3 people speaking at a time. A faction PvP-focused game cannot thrive if no one is there to oppose you. The game itself barely works as a solo game, as questing feels so cookie-cutter and generic, leading you down a very specific path with no deviation. Most dungeons are boring kill the trash, tank and spank the boss encounters, and when compared to the brilliant tower defense dungeon, and even Age of Wushu's complex and puzzle-like labyrinths, it comes across feeling very ho-hum from a company you know can do better. Speaking of Wushu, boy is this game ever Wushu. The nonsensical cash shop, the cheap animations, the dozens of overly convoluted systems, and the English-tastic script are all here, and if you prefer a game with polish, you won't see a drop of it from Snail. If you're not sold yet, this game certainly won't try to fix that. Next time, I'll be looking at my not-favorite company with its not-favorable community to look at a very favored game. Wish me luck!
Desired black gold, the double temptation. Desired black gold, the double temptation. The double temptation.